We're recording now. We're live. Woohoo! So the next thing we do in this class is to move from the unit of the individual as the subject of our genetic inquiries and look at genetics at the population level. Okay, we've already done a little bit of this. We kind of touched on this a little bit when we talked about, for example, which blood type was the most common in the world, right? And we determined that the most common blood type was one that was recessive, and I said, how could that be? And eventually we came up with the answer that, well, the people that have that gene have mated with other recessives, and they have a lot of homozygous children, and those are most of the people in the world, the largest number, and that's why we have more type Os, right? In that moment, we were sort of doing a little bit of population genetics, okay? And now we should do a little bit more and talk a little bit more about these processes. Let's see, that's no good. Oh, that's what's missing. This has to be moved over here. Now I have to use two computers. Let's see. Will it work? Ah. Now, that should be asking me which. Okay, well, hopefully that'll work. Should be asking me which of those screens we're looking at, but let's do that. And not that one. Is there another one down here? Yes. Okay, so just to do some quick review about some of the concepts that we have. Oh, that's right. That's what I wanted. That screen, record that display. Okay. Some quick review. This is the generalized model of how speciation occurs according to Darwin. Okay. So you have an original population. There's isolation that occurs between subgroups A and B. At this point, they have yet to diverge. The divergence begins, and ultimately, once you have complete isolation in enough time, you have divergence to the point where they're no longer able to reproduce with each other, and that leads to speciation. Okay, this is just a quick review. You know this already. One of the critical elements in this process is what's called reproductive isolation, and that has occurred, of course, geographically, historically. So you have examples of sort of obviously related birds that exist on continents apart, like the ostrich in Africa and the emu in Australia. You get what happens in populations is the rise of spontaneous mutations. And there are many of these that are very easy to find in the world. I told you everybody carries around 50 mutations with them that they inherit basically in the process of reproduction from one's parents, either through meiosis, usually through the meiosis, the process of producing gametes, and then of course fertilization, the zygote, and all of that. We see a couple of examples here. This is images from your book of spontaneous mutations. This is not an albino, but an alligator that has a condition called leucism. And we have seen this condition before because leucism is different than albinism in the sense that what it does is prevent pigment from being deposited in places in the body. So this is the yellow Labrador retriever problem in the form of an alligator, okay? Which this particular spontaneous mutation, meaning one that arises across evolutionary time with reproduction, is rather uncommon in alligators, okay? Theoretically, it would be something that would not be an advantage to this creature. Why? Yeah, if it's a stealth predator that's trying to hide and not be seen, it's not going to help it too much. If, however, you go to, what's it called? The Science Center that's in Golden Gate Park. It's right across from the De Young Museum. They have a big aquarium there. Is it called the California Science Center? I don't know the name quite right. It's great. Go there. If you're in San Francisco, go to it. But they have an alligator with leucism actually on display inside in this big pool. It's really kind of cool. Couple of other mutations. There's a mutation that can give cats white fur and blue eyes. Oftentimes due to something like pleiotropy, remember, which is when a single gene has multiple effects. Something that gives you an appearance like this or this may carry secondary traits that go along with it. Okay? In other words, the gene affects a series of traits, so it's not just that the cat's white and has blue eyes, it's also that they're very timid and they're deaf. Okay, and these things seem to all be genetically related, even if we haven't actually identified the gene, as the people who do the research in the film attempt to do. This is a cheetah that has a form of melanism, where it has additional melanin and gets darker. Okay, this is a very simple genetic mutation. They talked about it in the first part of the film with the mice that have darker coats. And that can survive on dark lava rocks. It is known as a condition called melanism. It is found around the world in many different species. Okay? In some species, it becomes more common than others. There is a fair amount of research that now indicates that melanism conveys certain other advantages to the creatures that have it. It's not just a question of, oh, the lion is dark, so it can't be seen at night, which of course lions hunt in the day, so it's not a big advantage to lions. It's also the case, for example, that in some species, melanism has been shown to convey resistance to certain viruses. So it may have health effects that are quite pronounced. It's not just a question of it helps a predator hide more effectively, or girls find it more attractive, right? There's always that sexual selection option, which is that maybe it's seen as an attractive feature, which is perfectly viable, actually. You do see when you study animal behavior, and this is true with humans too, mate preferences for certain traits, and there are mate preference patterns where melanistic members of species are sought out, right? So it could be a signifier of health, but it could be not just a signifier of health, but a real indicator of a health advantage, actually. And that sort of research is starting to be seen more and more. Now, if your species is really given a true advantage by this condition, as is the case with jaguars from South America, you may end up with a significant percentage of the population actually being melanistic. In the case of jaguars, about 6% of them are what's called panthers. Note that the panther, and you might not have noticed this if you were watching Jungle Book or something as a kid, actually still retains the rosetted spot pattern of the original jaguar. It just has a much darker overall fur color, right? So it just has greater amounts of melanin, but it also still has the pattern, and you can see it sort of through the black, actually. Melanistic versions of big cats like this lion and this jaguar are found all over the world. The leopard has a panther population within it as well. It hunts in a very similar way. Leopards and jaguars are actually quite similar. It's just jaguars come from the New World and leopards come from the Old World. So when you have a trait that appears with appreciable frequency in a population, such as 6% of jaguars in South America, that's called a polymorphism. Polymorphism just means it comes in multiple forms. So traits that differ with appreciable frequency in populations are called polymorphisms. They may or may not affect the phenotype. So some polymorphisms are silent mutations that have no impact on the phenotype. Some polymorphisms might be recessive, so they don't have an effect on the phenotype. There are different reasons for this, but a polymorphism is not just a phenotypic variation. It's not necessarily something you can see. It can also be genotypic, meaning that it's there in the genes, but perhaps not evident to your eye. Among humans, what are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are variations at the level of one rung of the ladder, occur extremely frequently. About 1 million of them exist in the human genome, which is approximately 0.17% of the overall genome. Okay. So they're a good little chunk. They're a good little chunk. And they're useful for telling who's related to whom, if you get into that study closely enough. People usually use mitochondrial DNA, but if you want to use your somatic DNA, you can. Some of these polymorphisms, these single nucleotide polymorphisms, do absolutely nothing. They're not coding DNA, so they're junk. In other cases, they actually do something important. Okay? So when we say single nucleotide polymorphisms, they may be something that affects the phenotype. They may not. Melanism in leopards is a monogenic recessive trait, meaning that it is controlled by a mutation in a single gene, and in order for it to be present in the phenotype of the panther, you have to be homozygous for that recessive mutation. Okay? It's not Mendelian. Okay? It's not a single point. It's not a single allele at a single place. It's a complex gene, but it's a single mutation within the complex gene produces this. And melanin is very easily mutated. That's why melanism is so common in nature. Now, when we look at the phenotype, which remember that up until, basically in the 1980s, people who studied variation in human populations could not study the genotype, right? So we couldn't study genes very closely until the 1980s. Prior to that time, when human evolution was studied, we looked at the phenotype and looked at variations in the phenotype among human populations. And in fact, that's why this class is called physical anthropology, because physical anthropology, initially, physical anthropologists studied physical variation across human populations, or they studied the physical remains of people. And that's why it's called physical anthropology. Technically, it should really be called biological anthropology, because at this point in history, it's much more biological than simply studying physical differences. And many textbooks call this subject bioanthro, actually, but we use the older name here. Been kind of thinking about changing that, just because it's more accurate at this point to call it biological anthropology. So one thing that you can see fairly easily, and they now know the genetic basis of this across species, and this seems to impact human populations as well, is that depending on where your human population lives, and it's not restricted to humans, but we can talk about humans, mammals in general that live in colder climates will have shorter appendages, meaning arms and legs, that are bulkier, and they'll have a stockier body. Okay? This Inuit Eskimo man kind of demonstrates this. He's also wearing a lot of fur, so that helps to make him look stockier. But his body type, even without his fur on, is stockier. People in hotter climates, and this goes for mammals in general, tend to have longer, slender limbs. And that's because if you have long, slender limbs, if you're tall and have slender limbs, you have a greater amount of surface area to volume, which means that you can dissipate heat more effectively. If you're stockier, you're going to retain heat because you have less surface to volume. Okay? If you measure these things, you'll just have to trust me. So for human populations, for example, like the Eskimo, you tend to find them having a bulkier body. Okay? For people like the Maasai from Kenya, you are much taller and thinner because you live in a tropical climate and your people have been there for quite a long time. So again, Allen's rule is that mammals in cold climates have shorter, bulkier appendages to conserve heat. Bergman's rule, which is related, is that among mammals, larger animals lose heat less rapidly than smaller. Okay? So this basically means that, for example, if you look at the distribution of bears in North America, the colder it is, the bigger the bear. The bigger bears live up north. Why? Because being bigger means that you conserve heat more effectively. As you go south, the bears are all related. Obviously, over evolutionary time, they diversify. But as they diversify, those in tropical climates typically will be smaller in size. Okay? With humans, Bergmann's rule is a little messier, and so is Allen's rule actually too, partly because humans move around so quickly that we change environments faster than evolution actually operates. So these rules, to some extent, hold true of human beings. They do apply to human populations loosely, but it's not as if it's a little bit more effective if you're exploring this subject to look at mammals, because other mammals do obviously migrate and move into new environments, but basically they're going to do that much more slowly over time. So you're going to see evolutionary effects more easily, right? Now, we'll talk about this next time. We'll probably get talking about it a little bit, but one trait that's important, or a set of traits that are important for human beings in terms of different populations, are what humans usually call race, right? So what we call race seems to be a set of traits that differ in different human populations, and the question is, do those differences between human populations reflect the fact that the different populations have lived in different environments? Okay, so we'll get into that question a little bit more after we cover basic population genetics, but that's a population genetics question. Okay, and we'll sort of explore that next time, particularly with skin color, because skin color is kind of an interesting example of how this works. Okay, now what you also get, this is sort of a variation between populations, right? Eskimos look like this. Bergmann's rule shows that, you know, if you're a Maasai, you look more like this. Okay, so that explains variation within our species according to populations, at least according to a couple of set of traits, right? Whatever, it explains one part of it. You also have variation between and within populations at the level of genetic disease. So what we find is that genetic disorders or diseases exist among certain individuals. We saw hemophilia, we talked about the royal families of Europe, but they exist at different frequencies. So some populations have higher incidences of certain genetic diseases, okay? And the reason for this is, well, the reasons for this are actually fairly complex, okay? This chart shows you a couple of different genetic disorders and diseases, and then some population variations according to frequency. On the top is phenylketonuria, which is kind of a particular cause of what people refer to as a form of mental retardation. It's a genetic disorder. It's autosomal recessive. Cystic fibrosis is another problem that causes cysts and usually death in people who suffer from it. And down here we have Tay-Sachs disease, which has a high incidence among Jewish populations, actually. So questions about how these kinds of disorders would be maintained in populations is something that people are interested in who study population genetics, right? If it is something that's really bad, that is to say it causes death prior to when members of the population, in this case humans, reproduce, there should be a strong selection pressure against it being maintained in the population. Okay? If it doesn't cause death prior to reproduction, then disorders, genetic disorders, can be maintained within populations for longer periods of time because the selection pressure is not so strong to remove it from the population. But nevertheless, there are some cases of very high frequencies of certain problems that in some cases, perhaps if an individual is homozygous, actually do cause death prior to reproduction. And that leads to very profound questions as to why that actually would be. Like, in other words, is there some other advantage that comes about from having this genetic disorder, right? Can it possibly, under some circumstances, be beneficial? Okay, and the classic example of this is sickle cell anemia, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But first, if I can get, if the computer will work, God help me, let's watch a a little short video about a population that suffers from a high rate of a condition called Huntington's disease and the research that is a part of that, if this will work. I'm having a lot of trouble with my internet connection as usual, but I tried to load this whole video while you were watching the other one. Let's see if it'll work.
Venezuela are the most likely.
All right, we need to go into speakers. Sorry about this, the new computer. We want.
In the world to develop the fatal condition Huntington's disease. For decades, one American researcher, Nancy Wexler, has been spending time there. It's where she discovered the gene that causes the disease, and it's a living laboratory for her work to find a cure.
Sorry, I need to get this sound right.
So would you say the healthiest way to reproduce would be outside your own race?
There isn't a yes or no answer to that question. I would say in general, as we learn from breeding animals, mutts are a good thing. But, you know, a major study of cousin marriages within populations showed that there was no significant genetic disadvantage to marrying your first cousin. So, to tell you the truth, the vast majority, the best answer I can give you is that the vast majority of variation within the human genome exists in whatever village your ancestors came from. Okay, so in other words, there is variation and difference between, say, you and a person who comes from Africa or you and a Native American, but actually that's a small percentage of the variation overall in the human genome, so you're pretty safe marrying that person from the village. And basically anybody you marry could be a problem. So the answer is yes, but it's not necessary. You're fine with marrying your own. But if you want to use... If you have a girlfriend that doesn't come from your ethnic group and you want to argue with your parents that you're better off, go ahead. You have my permission. Yes?
I mean, wouldn't Tay-Sachs, as an example, be kind of an argument for it? Because that's generally predominant among Orthodox and Messina, because they're both from a particular group of Jews that have that dominant gene. But
yes.
Non-Messian and non-Orthodox Reformed Jews it's non-existent among their culture because they're usually from a parent who's not Jewish. The mother and the father are Cohens. It doesn't matter. But so wouldn't that be kind of an argument on his side to say that certain diseases are found among certain groups of people, but if you deviate out of that group, you have less likely a chance of getting that?
Absolutely. If you're talking about anything that's a harmful recessive, you're more likely to end up homozygous if you marry somebody else that has the condition, so therefore it's a good thing. Those are the cases when it is better to marry somebody who's not closely related to your group. And those are the sorts of things that cause you a problem if you marry your brother or sister. Yeah, but in general, it's a very insignificant percentage. If you come from a group that suffers a high rate of a particular genetically based disorder, like Tay-Sachs or Huntington's, in most cases you can get tested to know whether or not you're a carrier, even if you don't have the actual traits, right, or the actual indicators that you're, you know, if you're a recessive carrier. So that's a good thing to know if you come from a population that has a high incidence. If you're Ashkenazi Jew, then go get tested for Tay-Sachs, among other things. It's a good thing to do before you get married. You still can marry the one you love, but perhaps you'd consider adopting children. So it's not, but yes, it's a good thing if you come from a population with a high incidence of a disorder to know where you stand, and in those conditions, the answer to his question would be yes. Run, don't walk to another group of people, or the next village, or the next continent, or get on a plane. Okay, so let's see, where are we with 1:15? Okay, this is about a 9-minute video. Let's go ahead and watch. This is on Huntington's disorder, and you'll learn a little bit about this.
On the shores of South America's biggest lake contends not just with poverty, but with a curious misfortune. The people of Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela are the most likely in the world to develop the fatal condition Huntington's disease. For decades, one American researcher, Nancy Wexler, has been spending time there. It's where she discovered the gene that causes the disease, and it's a living laboratory for her work to find a cure. Despite recent difficulties, not helped by tensions between Venezuela and the US, she still returns. Will Grant accompanied her on a recent visit.
Nancy Wexler is known as the Gene Hunter.
Mi hermana.